Okay, as Nancy makes her way up here, we'll get started. Okay, welcome back from lunch, everyone. We are going to pick up kind of where the last panel before Roy left off, talking about what's going on in markets right now. And we're going to talk about that at a high level across the country. And we also have some folks that can tell us a little bit more about what's going on the ground, particularly in Florida, Louisiana, and California. But as I think we've also heard this morning and over the conference, this isn't just isolated to these states anymore. We're seeing concerns about whether properties are becoming uninsurable, at least without public subsidy, pop up in lots of places around the country now. So we're going to just structure this as Q&A. I'm going to jump right in. We have an amazing array of experts here for you to hear from. You can see their titles and everything up here, so I'm not going to waste time on bios or me prattling on. So I want to start with Nancy, because you've been thinking about this for a really long time, and whether you could kind of set the scene for us about what you're seeing across the country and what the dynamics are of this moment.
Thanks, Carolyn. And sorry for keeping y'all waiting. So what we're seeing across the country is I guess easily understood if you understand like what are the pillars of a sustainable insurance market. We hear a lot about availability and affordability, but there's a third pillar, and it's called reliability. So just what we see in the insurance market is if you have availability, it's predicated on insurers being able to manage and measure the risk, and for them to be able to price the risk of for what they think that they're taking on with the risk transfer. If all those conditions are met, then availability is typically going to work out. Affordability is sort of obvious, that people will be able to pay the cost of risk transfer that's available in the market, and that they'll actually think they're willing to pay it as well as able to pay it. Reliability is what isn't talked about so much, but that is the confidence that the market will be predictable for the long term, and that the market will be fair. So what do I mean by that? That insurers can remain solvent. That's predicated on being able to get reinsurance. That regulation will be rational enough that they understand what's going to happen if they submit a rate filing, when they'll get a response. That the judicial and local environment is something that they can predict well enough and manage well enough to be relying on it in the long term. So if you have those three things, then you typically have a sustainable insurance market. With climate change, though, there are sort of cracks happening in all three of those pillars. And usually it's not just climate change all by itself, it's climate change interacting with existing weaknesses in the pillars. So the common thread, I'd say, is something we've talked about a lot, the buildup of exposure in high-risk areas, increased repair costs due to inflation, and then the thing that really has most to do with climate change is rapidly increasing risk. So that's especially true for the secondary perils, or what used to be called the secondary perils, which would be severe convective storm, wildfire, and flood. Those are the things that are really causing cracks in all three of the pillars. So what we're seeing as kind of a downstream impact is the reinsurance cost increases, the capacity decreases for reinsurance. And then we're also seeing insolvency and impairment coming from mostly out of Florida, which I think that was one of the major drivers of company insolvencies. That really had a lot more to do with a fraudulent environment, which to me is a reliability issue, than it did with climate change. But many of the companies that were writing in Florida also had exposure in some of the other areas, Louisiana and Texas, that were seeing lots and lots of events. So what we see is that for smaller carriers, regional carriers, they have fewer options to pull out. They're stuck in a market more so than a 50-state carrier that could make a choice to be a 49 or a 48-state carrier. So that has a sort of a contagious effect where will have a weakness in one market causing threats to solvency that affect other markets. So I think those are the things that I would say would be common to the effects that we're seeing across the market now. Locally, how they play out, a lot of times will have to do with the regulatory environment. If there are, as in California, there are disconnects or perceived disconnects, depending on how you think about it, between the actual risk and what you're able to charge. I think the peril matters a lot. For the wildfire peril in particular, there's actually a very high level of uncertainty about the risk at the home and community level. So it's common to think that insurers know everything about the home, they just don't choose to tell. And in the case of wildfire, that's really not the case. Insurers and reinsurers need to know a lot more to commit their capital. So I think the panel's going to have a lot more to say about local markets.
Thank you, Nancy, for setting the scene for us. With that as kind of background and context, let's now zoom in on a couple places and talk about how things are looking from the ground. So Kenneth, let's start with you. You're based in Louisiana. Can you tell us about what you're seeing maybe from the perspective of households or the groups that SBP works with?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. We've talked a lot about vulnerable communities and vulnerable families and low-income folks. I really want to put a name to it, right? Like I want to, I guess, center us for a moment. I took over the reins of SBP in New Orleans and Southeast Louisiana a little over a year ago, almost 2 years, right after Hurricane Ida. And one of the first families I met was a lady called Miss Ophelia. Miss Ophelia is a grandmother raising 5 of her grandkids. She has a son who is disabled. She is on Social Security, and she lives in Terrebonne Parish. We have parishes in Louisiana other than counties. And Terrebonne Parish is really by the bayou. It is the low part of Louisiana, right? This lady, during Hurricane Ida, she was living in a home that has belonged to her family for almost 100 years. That is flag number 1, right? 100 years ago, our building codes were not the same building codes as they are today. And so that is first flag that she is not safe in that home, right? However, when Hurricane Ida came, and Jessica talked about this, it ripped her roof off. In some places, it collapsed the roof. In some places, it ripped it off. What happened is the rain went into the house and then flooded her entire home, and she lost practically everything. This home, a small home where she raised 5 grandkids, and she was raising her disabled son. That home was completely flooded. This lady, Miss Ophelia, is on Social Security. And at the end of the month, after she has paid everything, all of her bills, all of her necessities, Miss Ophelia is left with about $65 left in her bank account. It's all she has left. So when you think about that, this lady has just lost everything. She did not have insurance because she could not afford it. Unfortunately, she didn't get the payout from FEMA that she thought she needed. And so she was stuck. If it wasn't for organizations like SBP, she would not have come back home at all. However, there are some funding that we have with SBP, and a lot of it is government funding and philanthropic funding, but some of them require us to ensure that our homeowners have insurance for at least a year after we finish rebuilding their home. We have been really, really lucky and blessed to sometimes write this into a lot of our grants, and so our organization is sometimes able to pay for the first year insurance after we have helped the home. We looked everywhere, right? After Ida, so many insurance companies were taking flight, rates were going up. We looked everywhere. We found a policy for her that was $200 a month. I was a 5th grade math teacher, but I don't think that I need to be a 5th grade math teacher to tell you $65 cannot pay a $200 a month bill. It is impossible. It's not going to happen. And so while she had a policy for a year and her year is just about up, Miss Ophelia is sitting at a kitchen table wondering, is she going to take food from her grandkids or is she going to pay for insurance? That's the conversation that she is having and so many other people around the state of Louisiana are having. Telly mentioned the other day about climate and weather, right? Her $65 is what she had a year ago. A year ago, we did not have 90-degree days every single day that we are having this summer. So I can guarantee you that she has been running her air conditioner because it is, I run my air conditioner to keep my family cool, or I don't run my air conditioner and my family suffers and our health suffers. And so her $65, in my book, I guarantee you has gone down to 15. But at the same time, our insurance has gone up to $250. And so how is she going to make $15 a month match $250? That is the conversation that so many individuals are having. And Liz eloquently said on yesterday as well that insurance is top of mind for so many people in Louisiana. That is true because we have watched Hurricane Lee that is going up right now. We have watched Hurricane Idalia that went from a hurricane category 1 to a category 3 in practically a day. We have watched how Hillary went to California in December of last year, 21 tornadoes in one day touched down in Louisiana. Storms are becoming more frequent and more severe. On Labor Day, parts of New Orleans flooded. Labor Day, just a few weeks ago. On yesterday, Atlanta flooded because of a thunderstorm. While we were in here, a community was flooded. That is happening more frequently. And homeowners are trying to decide, what am I going to do? Am I going to not pay for food and pay for insurance? Or am I going to pay for insurance and take food out of the mouths of our kids? And so that's the conversations that's happening in households.
Thank you for sharing that. Let's jump across the Gulf to Florida and get some other perspectives of how things are playing out. You have insurance challenges, but they're a little different as well. So, Galen, what are you seeing?
Yeah. Hey, guys. I'm from Miami-Dade County. I can't speak for all of Florida. I will try and do my best. But I think there are other people. I've heard a lot of talk about Florida, right? Like we have challenges at the state level, and we have all of those challenges too. We have the same residents. We have a lot of similar challenges. We have another one that is a lot of people are moving to Florida and investing their money there. And I think that yes to all of that, and yes to a lot of what people have been saying about challenges in the market and the context there with regulation and everything. But like one issue that we have is that the cost of insurance is going up, right? It's gone up. What do I have? In commercial insurance went up 37%. And we have the most expensive homeowners insurance. There are communities, cities near us that in our region that are the median insurance cost is $12,000 a year, right? That is a lot of money. And it's not going down. And that is going on top of a bunch of other rising costs, right? Like housing costs that are just going up. We have the fastest rate of inflation in Miami-Dade in the country. We're trying to keep on top of it, but it's just going up, and wages are going up, but not as fast. Okay, so I think that this is the squeeze that's happening, and insurance is part of it. And it's not just property insurance, right? So it's homeowners insurance, it's landlords, their insurance is going up. Commercial insurance, particularly for multifamily homes, is going up right now. It's very, very hard. It's not just hard to pay for it, it's hard to actually get it. That's the challenge. And then my car insurance is going up. And my car insurance doesn't even cover anything. Like, just to be honest, it doesn't. And we have really high, and that gets at another thing, right? We have high insurance participation rates in Florida. Everybody who moves to Florida knows that there are hurricanes. They know it. Every resident in Miami-Dade County gets a mailer every year that says this is your hurricane risk. And this year we've added in heat risk. We're letting people know, we're educating them, but what can they do, right? They get insurance if they can. They try not to let it lapse, but does it cover what they need? And I can tell you my car insurance went up like 30%, and my coverage is going down, right? And that's everybody in South Florida drives, unfortunately. And they're all seeing that. And the people who are homeowners are seeing their insurance go up 20% minimum. in general. So that's,
Let's stick with Florida. Florida has some unique insurance programs, maybe the only state with their own reinsurance program. Lori, I want to shift over to you. You've looked at the 3 different state programs in Florida a lot and how they interact. Can you give us an overview of how they operate?
Sure,
Great,
yeah. So a lot of people in the room are aware that Florida is probably one of the leading catastrophe regions in the world, and I've argued for about 15 years that it's the world's largest insured catastrophe risk. The word insured there is key because of the amount of insurance penetration that Florida has. So most people do have really decent homeowners insurance there, and there are legacy reasons why that is. Probably if we were looking at insuring Florida today from scratch, we would take a very different approach to insuring, but because of legacy reasons, there's very attractive, I'll even call it handsome. I'm from the South, we use the word handsome a lot when we mean pretty. So it's very handsome insurance coverage for most Floridians. And so I want to give you sort of the backdrop, like where we are today, what Florida looks like, at least from my standpoint today, and there are other Florida experts in the room as well that may want to weigh in, may even disagree with me on some things. But then I'll back up and tell you a little bit, just for the people who aren't as familiar, about how Florida maybe got where it is today. Again, my view. But again, I'll argue Florida's the world's, the globe's largest insured catastrophe risk because of the amount of total insured value that is insured in a very high-risk region with a really heavy-duty, large loss peril as its peak peril. So the peak peril is tropical cyclone, hurricane. That doesn't surprise anyone, but it might surprise some people to know that Florida is also a leading state for tornado and other serious, severe convective storms, for wildfire, and certainly for flood. They also get sinkholes, and sinkholes are covered by insurance in Florida, and that's no small deal either. So there are several, as Nancy said, secondary perils that are leading Florida's losses other than just hurricane and other tropical storms. So that kind of helps you with a little bit of the context for why we get more complexity in our problems than we see in some other states. There are 2 risk financing, I'll call them interventions in the state. So interventions by the state in order to help provide risk financing when people are having difficulty with the availability or affordability of their insurance policies. One of those is Citizens Property Insurance Corporation, and the other is the Florida Hurricane Catastrophe Fund. We know that there's federal coverage for flood through the NFIP. So there's that federal program, and then there are the 2 state programs that, although they are primarily focused on hurricane, actually have impact across all perils. Particularly Citizens Property Insurance Corporation is a multi-peril, typically a multi-peril policy that is sold, and so they have losses not just from hurricane, but that residual insurer, if you will, state-run residual insurer, has losses from other things as well. And to Nancy's point, fraud is a big problem, not only in Citizens, but across private insurance companies in the state as well. We're having tremendous fraud problems and litigation related to fraud that contributes to the cost in Florida, not just the perils that I mentioned. So just to give you a sense of how big the fraud problem is, I think homeowners' claims in Florida, I think maybe we represent maybe still around 11% of the nation's homeowners insurance claims. That's a lot for 1 out of 50 states, but we represent more than 70% of homeowners insurance litigation across the country. So we have our natural perils, and then we have our human perils as well. And the problem of fraud litigation cannot be ignored as part of the problem. So the Florida Hurricane Catastrophe Fund and Citizens Property Insurance Corporation were both sort of the impetus for both of those. I'll say roughly, and I'm doing a 30,000-foot overview here, so this is going to be butchered. I'm butchering the facts a little bit on purpose just to get through quickly. But the impetus for both of these was more or less the insurance crisis that was caused by Hurricane Andrew. And so both of these entities were formed. Citizens Property Insurance Corporation was formed out of the amalgamation of other entities that already existed. And then the Florida Hurricane Catastrophe Fund was started from scratch. And Citizens Property Insurance Corporation, I believe at the time, was really intended to be a residual market for people mostly in the southernmost part of Florida who were having difficulty getting insurance for their homes. And then the Florida Hurricane Catastrophe Fund was a response to reinsurance prices spiking, as you've heard about from other speakers, making the market really difficult for insurers. And so the state created the CAT Fund in order to create a market that created stability for insurers who would remain in the state. If they would remain in the state, there would be stability for a pseudo reinsurance policy that they could buy, more of a reimbursement policy from the CAT Fund that would help them basically stay in the state through tough years, through hurricanes. So if they had a hurricane, they would get reimbursements from the CAT Fund. Now, both of these entities are, I'm going to say, alive today. I'm not going to say well, so not alive and well, but definitely alive. They're both very large portions of the risk financing market in Florida. For instance, Citizens Property Insurance Corporation right now is at, I believe, almost 2 million. Has it topped? Anyone in the room? Has it topped 2 million policies yet? Is it almost? What's that? Not yet, but we think we're headed to 2 million policies, and to put that in perspective, that's probably representing about 20% of the state, of the policies that are available to be bought and sold at this point. So you're talking about a large portion of the state is now insured, a large portion of the residential risk in the state is now insured through through Citizens Property Insurance Corporation, and the capacity for citizens to pay claims is impeded by the way that they're allowed to price. That's getting a little bit down in the weeds, but I'll just say that for opinion now, and that'll be a leading remark if somebody wants to ask a question later. And the Hurricane Cat Fund, almost every residential insurer in Florida has to participate in the Hurricane Cat Fund. The Hurricane Cat Fund's statutory capacity, meaning the amount that they are on the hook for if we were to have a probable maximum loss event, the amount that the Cat Fund's on the hook for is $17 billion. They do not, and that doesn't come near the probable maximum loss amount, which is closer to $90 billion. So the CAT Fund is on the hook for a piece of a $90 billion potential loss, a 250-year return period loss, and does not have the capacity in reality, does not have access to the funds to come up with that $17 billion if they needed to at the moment. So that's where I'll let that set the stage, and then.
Great, thanks, Lori.
Yeah.
We can tell there's some unique things about Florida.
Yes.
Let's come back now to Louisiana. Matt, I want to turn to you. You are from Louisiana, I think. Share with us your perspectives on what's going on.
Sure, and thank you. That's very loud. So yeah, I'm wearing a couple of different hats today. So I lead Pew's line of work around state resilience policy. So I'm based here in DC. But prior to that, I spent about a decade in Louisiana state government. I'm a native of Louisiana. So if you want to talk about unique, let's talk about Louisiana for a minute. So I think one of the ways to maybe think about the difference between the Florida market and the Louisiana market is, if you were to hop on a boat in Miami and ride for an hour or so, you might end up at a tiki bar on Bimini. You hop on a boat in Golden Meadow in Lafourche Parish, Louisiana, and you ride for an hour or so, you might have the distinct pleasure to hang out next to an oil rig. So the way that I'm sort of laying that out is to say, Louisiana's coast is not a glamorous coast. It's a working coast. It's an industrial coast. And there's a population there, a working class population that has been in place for generations now that services those industries. But I'll also point out that, what's happening with respect to climate change, while it is having a profound impact on Louisiana, and I'll mention that in a moment, but, Louisiana's coast has never been an easy place to live. And so if you chart out how the city of New Orleans was founded. So Bienville goes significantly up the mouth of the Mississippi River to found New Orleans. Now, obviously, there were land use decisions that might have been sort of better made at that time as well. But the reason he did that is because the coastal landscape in Louisiana was too harsh, right? And so when you think about what that means that there's a historic development pattern in Louisiana by which some of its most marginalized communities have been pushed to the outliers of Louisiana's coastal landscape, and as a consequence, most exposed to ever-increasing risk. And so that includes, for instance, in a place like Plaquemine Parish, it started with Croatian immigrants, and then later on, Vietnamese and Cambodian immigrants. Several tribal communities have been pushed out to the outliers, and a lot of those communities are now sort of mixed together in a way that has become problematic politically. But what I'm trying to say here is that I think in wide swaths of the Florida coast, right, you have this rent curve that is essentially high-value real estate along the coast, and as you move inland, those prices decline. Whereas in Louisiana, it's the opposite of that, right? And so, somebody pointed out, my friend Liz yesterday said that, she's, insurance is top of mind for everybody in Louisiana. I would actually say what concerns me more is all of the people that are not thinking about insurance because they don't have it. They haven't had it for a long time. And, one of the things associated with that is that you do have high rates of homeownership in some of Louisiana's most vulnerable places. And that housing tenure is specifically tied to the idea that people have been in place in specific communities for a very long time. In many cases, their homes have been passed down from generation to generation. It represents the only source of wealth that many of these families have. And as insurance rates have gone up and as risk has increased, there's not been an ability to maintain policies in many cases. So I think I would sort of lead with that to say that the availability issue and the affordability issue are certainly profound in Louisiana, but that's not a new sort of set of circumstances. What I would say is slightly new is that the factors are changing, I would say, more rapidly than Louisiana can adapt, right? And what I mean by that is when I started working for state government in Louisiana, we were recovering from the devastating 2005 storm season, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. And the state has taken great strides to ensure that specifically another Katrina-type situation really can't happen again. So the Army Corps came in and built the Hurricane Storm Damage Risk Reduction System. Louisiana has a coastal master plan that charts out risk and has a series of restoration and projects to reduce risk at scale. Those are good things. And so, the Hurricane Katrina 2.0, if it were to happen, it would not have the same impact on New Orleans and broadly in Louisiana as it had the first time around. However, if you had like a Hurricane Harvey that just sat over the New Orleans metropolitan area and dumped rain, that would be a much bigger problem. And I point that out because I was working for the state in 2016 when we had two about 1,000-year rain events, depending on how you want to measure it, across the state. And the state was wholly unprepared for the idea that it would receive that much rainfall at the scale that it received in so many places, leading to flash flooding and riverine flooding events. And so since that time, the state has sort of doubled back, and now they're trying to figure out how they're going to address that type of flooding issue. And they're making strides, right? I think you heard yesterday about Louisiana's updated building codes. That's a good thing. But I'll say that the paradigm is shifting again. So I was actually in Alabama a few weeks ago. I ran into Roy Wright there, and I was having a conversation with the director of the Alabama Emergency Management Agency. And he mentioned, I've got a bunch of people in Louisiana right now fighting wildfires. Now, I will tell you, in my entire tenure working for the state of Louisiana, I don't think I mentioned the word wildfire once. Like, not once. I was talking to Charles Sutcliffe yesterday, too. I don't think he said it either until recently. So I think the problem in Louisiana is that every time it seems to try to get an understanding of the last thing that happened, there's some new thing that crops up. Now, apparently, Tornado Alley is shifting south and to the east to include wide swaths of Louisiana and the New Orleans metro area. And so what that means is more high-value real estate, larger populations are now being exposed to high degrees of risk that sort of counteracts the reason why those places were founded where they were founded to begin with, right? And that changes the marketplace in such a way that you've seen some of the derivative impacts on carriers leaving the state and the like. But I would remind everybody that there is also a huge population of folks that are historically disenfranchised, historically underrepresented, that have been in a high degree of risk for a long time. And as more people are experiencing more risk in Louisiana, let's not forget the people that have been at the margins for a long time.
Thank you. You mentioned fires. Let's keep going with fires now. Frank, I'm going to take this down to you. You've been working on insurance issues now, as I understand it, for a while, but you didn't grow up in insurance. You're a fire chief. So tell us a bit about what brought you to insurance, and I'm interested too in what that means more broadly for people who are sort of on the front lines of risk management and how they can engage in some of these insurance challenges.
Very good, and thank you for having me. And if you hadn't said wildfire before, before I met Nancy at the other end, I hadn't said actuary. Certainly didn't know how to spell it at that time. Yes, I'm primarily out of the fire service. I started in 1979, but I'm a late arrival to the, is it too loud?
I think you just angle it this way.
Perfect, is that better? Okay. I started noticing maybe around 2010, 12, things were different. They weren't just outliers on the ground. They were different in terms of intensity, frequency, and things that we were seeing. It wasn't until about 2017 I had my first real disconnect of realizing that the way public safety was evaluating at least wildfire risk, that's what most of my background is. I've been to floods and other types of emergencies, but particular to this meeting, wildfire is what I'll focus on. And I realized that the way public safety was evaluating or interpreting risk was different than the insurance industry. I had some property owners that passed our defensible space inspection on a Monday. By Thursday, they got a non-renewal notice for the same risk, and I, the supposed fire professional, could not answer their questions. And so that started the conversation on how we're looking at this. And before we go any further, I want to say just thank you to you and your staff for pulling this group together. It feels like a long overdue handshake between a lot of people. Like we all work together, we work around each other, but it's a different setting. We're having different conversations here. And so I really appreciate that. And part of what I realized is that with one of the things I'm thinking about as I'm listening to the conversations, I had notes from a few days ago and I scratched all of them after listening to you yesterday. A lesson, not a good one, from the fire service is that while we both do suppression and prevention, we tend to rely very heavily on the suppression side. And we do prevention work. We've gotten better at it over the years. But the truth is, you look at any budget, any place, and the suppression part of the budget is larger. There's a lot more emphasis there. And some of that is holding costs. There's a lot to have readiness cost out there. But we've significantly dropped the number of structure fires over 30, 40-year period. And that's primarily due to prevention. And it makes me wonder, where would we be now had we put as much effort in prevention over that time period as we did on suppression? And I share that because maybe it's a lesson you can learn from us sooner. As I listen to the discussions, I'm hearing a lot about risk transfer. Hearing less about mitigation. There's more coming to it, right? But I've come to the conclusion that we can't suppress our way out of this, we can't regulate our way out, and we can't price our way out. We'll need all three of those, but we have to bring mitigation to bear in a way that we never have, and we have to do it in a way that's aligned. We'll talk more about that later, but I would just share the idea that we have to come to a common way that we look at this. Just like a hurricane, a flooding event, earthquake, snowstorm, fire, none of them really care about the different ways that we interpret that. And so, real quick from the crowd, give me a couple of adjectives you've heard to describe the current wildfire losses that we're seeing. Anybody? What's that? Unprecedented. Unprecedented. Catastrophic. Uninsurable. Certainly no status quo, business as usual. But I feel like independently, we're still trying to work within our current paradigms of solutions. whether it's in public policy, whether it's in academic research. We're still trying to pedal the bikes we're familiar with faster, and that's not going to work. So I would just say until we start using some of the adjectives you just used to describe what we're seeing on the ground, and if we're afraid to use those adjectives towards the type of problem solving that we need to collectively figure out, we're not actually going to change outcomes. It'll be, to Roy's point, just another decimal point on admiration of the problem. And the other part is, if I spend much time with it, you'll figure out that sometimes I can be a little, we're used to making tough decisions, right? And one of the things we try to teach our people early is, if you can't change an outcome, don't expend a resource, especially a scarce resource. Can't change the outcome, don't use things that you can use in another place that could change an outcome. Those are tough decisions. And I think in that standpoint, we need to pursue evidence-based mitigations ruthlessly. There's too much at stake. You've all made the point here 100 times over, that what's coming our way is going to get worse. The things that are causing the wildfire losses, accumulation fuels, development in fire-dependent landscapes, and climate change, none of those are going to self-stabilize. We're going to have fires, and lots of them. The question is, how are we going to adapt to face that? We're not going to move these communities. So we have to figure out, how do we mitigate the current inventory we have, and how do we better build what we need to do in the future in the middle of a housing crisis? And the last thing I'll share with you is, some people ask, say, why at your age are you going back to an academic institution and running a Wildland Urban Interface Institute? It's because in my career, I've seen us twice now handle problems of this magnitude and this difficulty. One of them has to do, I just shared, right? We've seen a true bend down of risk on interior fires. We can do that in the WUI space. We just have to decide if we have the will or not to do it. There's not a whole lot of mystery about what needs to be done. So this can be done, but we just all have to decide that we have to get uncomfortable about where we're going to go next. The only thing standing in our way are some sacred cows. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. That takes us where I'm hoping we can go next, which is to start thinking about some solutions. And Nancy, I want to come back to you and also get your thoughts on the extent to which we need different solutions in all these places, or similar solutions. So,
Sure, and I think I will say it's helped a lot to talk to Frank almost every day for about a year and a half now. I've crystallized a lot of thinking. I think there's some common elements across these different areas that the panel has touched on. One, I think, thing to consider is that many of the policy actions that have been tried and floated are really possibly going to backfire and accelerate the collapse of the insurance market, and not have the benefit that they want to have. And that typically happens because they're focused at affordability and availability, but they're not actually thinking about reliability. And they're usually predicated on either downplaying the risk or looking for somebody else's money to pay for the risk. And unfortunately, I don't think either of those solutions will work in the long run, although they might feel politically feasible. The second thing that I would say is that resistance to admitting that the risk we're dealing with is high is extremely difficult to overcome. There's a lot of arguments like it will hurt real estate values, it will hurt vulnerable people to say that they're in high-risk areas. The situation is uncertain, and so you're asking us to take hard political action, but you don't actually know exactly what will happen. And that is actually because everything we're dealing with is unprecedented, and the future will not look like the past. So there is an ability to defer or deflect by shooting the messenger, by attacking the models, by pointing the blame back at certain sectors, rather than getting to mitigation. To Frank's point, if the only real way out of this is by facing the risk, looking straight at the risk, doing our best to understand it, and then trying to figure out how to bend down the risk curve. This is also hard. There's typically a disconnect between who owns the risk, who understands the risk, and who can do something about it. Who owns the risk? It's usually homeowners and local communities, and to a certain extent GSEs. Who understands the risk? To a fairly high extent, insurers and modelers, although as I mentioned, they don't always understand it to the extent that everybody wants them to. And who can do something about it? Often that does require other people's money, and that requires very explicit decisions about subsidization and prioritization of funds. So my general idea for solutions would be to increase the focus on community resilience. Think of things at the community level. Try to define community actions that really make a difference in changing the current hazard to reduce the risk. And come up with common words and common language and common standards that can be recognized as making a difference. And then finding the funds to prioritize the misophilias, the people who really are in harm's way, give them better information and better choices. I think it's not just a money question, it's not just paying for insurance, it's sometimes moving them out of harm's way. Even though I'm sure a 100-year-old family home is not something that anyone wants to abandon, if it's that or being destitute and having their families be in harm's way, I think better options at least is better options. So there's going to need to be accountability for where the risk ends up, which does mean more transparency around quantification and government solutions to adapt and to bring more money towards mitigation, the nature-based solutions we've heard about, and possibly relocation for people if they're not going to be able to build back better.
Thanks, Nancy. Keeping with the solutions theme, Lori, I want to ask you to reflect more on these state programs. And can we start to look across some of them and get some ideas about what makes a better state residual market? Or maybe we shouldn't even call them that anymore if they're as big as Florida Citizens, but than others. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I thank you for leading off with the possibility that these are not really properly considered residual markets going forward. I mean, this is, so in Florida, I'll just for a moment go back to Florida and say that, you know, for some time, the residual markets, the residual insurers in Florida that were intended to originally to only help insure risks that were considered exceptionally high, right? That's become a market that's insuring a huge swath of Florida residential risk. And as we see climate change create more and more losses in places like Florida, then we can only expect to see that expand more. So I really appreciate the comment that this is expanding to become, you know, these residual markets are expanding to become something more than residual, and we need to deal with that problem while we're thinking about the overall solution. Like, even if there weren't climate change, we would have problems. We have market problems. And so climate change is exacerbating market problems that already exist. So hearkening back to some of the words that other people here at the table with me, but other people in previous panels have said, you know, there are some key aspects to residual markets. In other words, government interventions in the risk financing for catastrophes. You know, one key aspect is why they do it. What's the purpose of intervening? And generally speaking, I mean, I'm an academician, so I apologize. We tend to think in, you know, ideal terms, I know. But ideally, they're intervening for solvency reasons, for the tail risk that the private market just can't afford, a tail risk that scares the private market, and in some of these cases, certainly understandably so they could intervene to help with tail risk, in other words, insurance, private market solvency issues, or they can intervene to help with the availability, affordability issue that you've heard people talk about previously. And that's, in regulatory terms called market conduct. It's a market conduct problem. So those are your two areas. Solvency, market conduct is why governments intervene. If we are intervening to create sources for financing catastrophe risk, so if that's the intervention, that's a pretty big intervention. That's not just regulating more tightly or regulating more loosely or trying to help the private market along. That's a really strong intervention. And so if you're going to do that, you really need to try to do that without unintended adverse consequences. And what we've seen in Florida, what we've seen in Louisiana, certainly, and I think less so in California based on the research that I've done or I've read, but still exists, is we've had a lot of unintended consequences. So you might have started with good purpose for why you had these government interventions to help create sources of financing for homeowners, but you end up with unintended consequences because, in some cases, you simply have affordability problems along with the availability problems, and that makes, and again, hearkening back to Florida, that makes the residual insurer's job a little more interesting. For instance, in Florida, what we ran into was once that the two residual markets created availability, they were under a lot of pressure to make the insurance affordable. Once they made it affordable, without getting down into the weeds again, they really started competing. And I shouldn't say they, but the Citizens Property Insurance Corporation at one point was actually charged with competing with the private market. So it was intentionally crowding out the private market, and that's really, I think, an unintended consequence of an original thought to have government intervention that was intended to help. But once you're crowding out a private market, then you're creating other problems, right? So to answer Carolyn's question, it is complicated. It's not easy to say, here's how the ideal residual market looks. But what I will say is something more thoughtful that takes into account, it doesn't try to standardize everywhere, but takes into account the actual economy. To Kenneth's point, that looks very different in Louisiana from what it looks in Florida. In Florida, we have, I think, goodness, what were the latest stats I saw was, the percent of homes that are second homes, they're vacation homes, in Florida is like 10%. Well, that's, still, okay, 90% are primary residences, but that's the largest in the country percentage-wise, I believe. Or no, not largest in the country percentage-wise. I think they have the largest number of vacation homes in the country, around 1 million. But they're maybe more like 5 or 6 in terms of the percentage, so I apologize for that. But you have different markets, right? You've got to take into account, we have to make hard decisions when we're thinking about residual markets, when we're really trying to keep them residual and not have them crowd out the private market, which may still be interested in the risk. So if you have Florida, where you have 10% of the homes are actually second homes, they're not primary residences, and you have Louisiana where that's going to be a lot less likely to be anywhere near 10%, then the residual market, it makes sense it would take that into account. Someone who can afford to not be there, in other words, maybe shouldn't be propped up by a residual market. Those numbers don't even take into account people who have chosen to retire to Florida, and it is their primary residence, but they made a voluntary choice. That's tough. I mean, that's tough to say and tough to hear. I know lots of people who retired to Florida, but I think at some point we have to make the hard choices. Have you chosen to retire somewhere that you can afford to self-insure if you have a loss? And if you don't want to or cannot afford to self-insure that, rethink. So I think migration here makes sense. So residual markets that instead of creating distortions to subsidize people to live in a place we don't think that is necessarily the best place for them to be going forward, I think that residual markets that incentivize mitigation, yes, but also incentivize adaptation and to have people move around, migrate to areas who have the voluntary ability to do so, to areas that are lower risk. I'll stop there for now, but I think it does come down to mitigation and adaptation.
Let's pick that up. and come back to Nancy's point about not ignoring or pretending the risk's not there, which I think often comes down to building and land use. So Matt and Galen, I was hoping you could tag team a little bit and talk about those two issues of building and land use in your respective states.
Sure. So first I'll maybe put my Pew National hat on for a moment. So we supported a piece of research through Carlos Martin and his team at the time at the Urban Institute that took a look at planning efforts across the country. So it was a national survey around this resilience topic. And some of the statistics were fairly startling, right? So 98% of the plans that were surveyed failed to account for population growth, population movements within a particular jurisdiction, potential loss as a result of climate impact. 84% of those plans did not examine disproportionate impacts on socially vulnerable populations. And as I think sort of a commensurate statistic, 39% of plans, so in the inverse, 61% didn't have any particular mechanism to direct resources toward those same communities at the nexus of vulnerability and risk. So I point that out because Louisiana is not an outlier. And so while it has taken, I think, appropriate steps to strengthen its state building code, for instance, we talk about that population issue, right? Where people are going to move, how they're going to move, where they're going to end up. I don't think Louisiana has really sort of wrapped its arms around the idea that people are already moving away from risk and in some cases toward new risk. So that's a long way of saying, we've got kind of a laissez-faire development history in Louisiana. In many places across the state, when we talk about land use, zoning is more a defensive tactic the Saints might use on an NFL Sunday than a mechanism to align a development pattern with a current and future risk profile. So I think there's work to be done in that regard. I think if you look at what a lot of states do across the country, there's a local comprehensive planning requirement. Many states, Washington, New Jersey, both come to mind, have put in new provisions that require those local comprehensive plans to take into account current and future climate impact and commensurate population changes as a result. So Louisiana's not there yet. So yeah, maybe I'll leave it there and turn things over to Florida.
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna take this moment to say that, yeah, in Florida and in Miami, we have some of the most progressive planning and zoning in the country. And don't know that that's worked, right? We have an urban development boundary that is pretty impressive and incredible that it happened, but it's constantly pushed against. And our state has not been consistent with its planning requirements. And it makes things challenging. So we're in that context. And so I think that that's relevant. And I also don't know if that system is flexible enough to deal with climate change. Things are changing, and we don't have a mechanism within that system that is rapid and responsive. But what I do know is happening is that communities that are investing in risk reduction have some weird incentives happening. I did research in Miami Beach. We all know Miami Beach, right? There's not a low-income community, but it does have low-income residents and a lot of low-income workers. And Miami Beach in 2015 had $25 billion, 7 square miles, $25 billion. That's huge. The adaptation gap in that place is $1 billion. That's 2015. Today, we have $51 billion. All right? That's after investing $500 million in stormwater mitigation. So what happened? Right? This is beyond insurance. This investment led to more value. And that is exactly what Miami Beach is trying to do so that they can pay for more investment. That's explicit. They've written it down. And part of that, I think, gets to what we can do and talk about here is that they don't know where best to put their investments so that they can get returns from the insurance industry. But they do know if they put it out there and make it visible and promote the hell out of their community and say that they did it in national media, then they'll get investments and they can keep going. So if you want, there's like some perverse information. And I think if we can share more, this is just to beat the drum to what people have said, if we can share more, we'll make better decisions. And maybe we won't drive ourselves over a cliff, because that's what I'm afraid of. And I'm afraid of this segmentation. This comes from conversations with Carolyn. I'm afraid that we're going to segment within Miami-Dade County, because Miami Beach's response is very different than a majority minority community that you might not know about called North Miami Beach. They do not have the resources. They're just up the road, and they're not making the same investments. And they are much more vulnerable because of that, and people aren't looking at it. And I'm concerned about that uneven piece. Are we going to be able to pool the risk, or are we going to separate and let some communities fall off? So like that's my fear. And I will just close with like a little shift. So I'm from northern Minnesota, and I grew up with a lot of Ojibwe people around. And I've been hearing from some of the native folks in the country around adaptation to say, look at the seasonality of what's going on. And I think that to get at this like mechanistic approach, there's something, we're in a season of rising risk. That's what's happening. We have to change the way, some of the ways of the things that we do. And I think there are some communities here who've survived for a long time through changes in the context that they live in that we could listen to. And we can listen to our own communities more. But I really think we should approach this as a seasonal shift. This isn't, there's something big happening, and we might have to move a little bit. We definitely have to change the tools that we're using, right? Because in the winter you need snowshoes, and in the summer you need a canoe.
Thanks, Galen. Kenneth, I want to come back to you. We've talked a lot over the last day and a half about the challenges with paying high premiums. What about the cost of mitigation and the folks that SBP works with? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you so much. On yesterday, I think it was Eleanor who made the comment, if we invest in risk mitigation, it'll be cheaper on the back end. That is so true. And that is a lot of what SBP is trying to do, is how do we, when we get into individuals' homes, we build back better. And we use resilient and sustainable materials when we do that. So what that looks like is we use vinyl plank flooring that we know that can get wet. We use denim installation when we're insulating someone's home. We have this really cool new thing where we're putting kitchen cabinets that are made of PVC material inside of people's homes. And so when the kitchen is wet, these materials won't swell like normal wood. It's something that is water resistant. All of that is great. We also, and Roy gave an amazing presentation about Fortified, we try to fortify as many houses as possible. That is something that we 100% believe in, and we have so many proof points of how Fortified works. But the challenge is affordability and accessibility, right? To have risk mitigation, it costs us a little bit more than normal materials, right? And so we talked about Fortified. That costs us about $3,000 to $5,000 more to fortify your house than it is putting a normal roof on there. And to us, there is so much benefit of doing that. But to individuals, as Matt talked about, who are underserved and misophilias of the world, they can't afford that, right? They don't have the full ability to do it, and they don't have access to it. And so even through government programs that are coming in, and Liz very eloquently said on yesterday, we in Louisiana are headed in the right direction, and we're starting a new, which will launch sometime next month. It's the Louisiana Fortified Homes Program. And it is an amazing program that is going to put $10,000 to homeowners to fortify their roofs. However, when you look at the qualifications of that program, first, there are so many individuals in New Orleans, or in Louisiana, should I say, who have old homes. And these homes can't get a fortified certificate because of the way that they were built, right? They were built to old standards. And go back to Miss Ophelia, and we did everything we could to fortify her home, but she couldn't get the certificate because of the foundation that she was built on. It's just a 100-year-old home. The building practices that they had don't match with today. And so that program, as great as it is, it really eliminated a number of people that could be in that program. The second thing is you have to have homeowners insurance in order to be in that program. But we also learned yesterday that the amount of people along the Mississippi River who don't have insurance is startling. So it once again decreased the number of individuals who could benefit from that program and have access to that. But it's also only going to give you $10,000. And the homeowner has to cover whatever the difference is. So again, for a third time, it's decreased the number of people that can be in that program. And so as great as this program is, and as much as we have tried to preach and tell everyone risk mitigation, and these are the ways to do it, there are a number of challenges because folks just can't access it, and they don't have the financial resources and affordability to benefit from those programs. They're in some ways being priced out. And so what this is really doing is it's keeping Miss Ophelia in the same tax bracket that she was in before, and the same risk that she was in before, because there is no way to get her out of it, right? And so there's a lot of challenges that we're facing, but I think it really boils down to affordability and access to these programs.
Okay, Frank, back to you. You've been working on these mitigation questions for a while. You talked about the shift in your community from suppression a little bit more into mitigation. Can you tell us more about how that's going and how to push it further?
Yes, thank you. Not just obviously the community I was in last, but that's a pretty broad shift, especially in the West. I think as we're talking about what would it take to get, better saturation, penetration of mitigations, three things come to mind, but they all fall under one phrase, I guess. We in this room have to connect the last mile to the people who are not in this room. And essentially, it's the homeowners and it's local government. I think we have the one former mayor here at some point. And I see it in these ways. The first is we have to translate the mitigation. You need to see the mitigations at a level of actuarial valuation. We have to make that case. That has to be evidence-based. We can't waste time on things that don't actually change the outcome on a hot, dry afternoon. That said, we're not making that case to the average homeowner. If you look at, think of the people in your communities, right? Most of them are, we've heard it over and over again, especially for the different types of communities we're talking about in the demographic. These aren't people working, one job. These are people working multiple jobs, trying to get kids to school, right? In some cases, these communities are places, again, focusing back on the wildfire side, in some cases, it's as simple as a big gulp and a rake, if you're healthy, a couple times a year. Other places, you may have to take down trees that it's a $15,000 proposition. You may not know how to run a chainsaw, or you may not have the physical ability to do it. So the first one is we have to drive hard, relentlessly at evidence basis for the mitigations that we're all going to circle around and start the longitudinal studies that will determine efficacy over time. We need to get better at this over time. We will unfortunately have more Paradises and Lahaina's, and we at least need to figure out how do we understand the facts on the ground at the parcel level, presence or absence, so that when we're looking at post-fire reconstruction, we actually know what's working and what's not. We need to get better at this over time. So to actuarial evaluation and making the case to the property owner who, we need to provide support there, and yet there are an awful lot of things that don't require a tremendous amount of support. There are a lot of things that just have to make the value proposition to a person who's got a scarce amount of time. Maybe there's a small amount of resource help that they need, but it's still, I don't think we're making that case well enough to them. Makes perfect sense to us, but we're not doing that well. I was talking with Dr. Boomhauer at lunch. He's doing some research I'm keenly interested in, but we have to better understand that last mile disconnect. And the third one is, was talked about yesterday, moral hazard at the local government level. I think there's some things that will pull local government into this discussion in a way they haven't been yet. I don't know, but it seems likely. When Paradise had its incident, The loss of property tax obviously wiped out a lot of things, including the ability to service municipal bond debt. Now, in that case, that ignition point started from a utility that had pretty substantial resources. Had that been a lightning strike, we would have had some of these discussions earlier by now. The impacts on default would have been a lot broader. And it seems to me that once the municipal bond market understands that the primary way to service the debt that it puts out is at the risk that we're all struggling with here, I don't see how that doesn't translate into some other muni bond challenges, even if it's just rating. Once you have the cost of lending on the table with local government, moral hazard for bias on inaction probably goes away, or at least it certainly gets nudged pretty hard. And I think that needs to happen. So essentially, we need to close that last mile loop between our respective professions, and that's going to be an actuarial evaluation of risk on an evidence basis, make the case, the value proposition to the people that are the property owners, and we have to remove the moral hazard for local government to not necessarily be engaged as aggressively as we need them to be.
Thank you, all of you. I had many more questions I wanted to ask this amazing group of people, but we only have 5 minutes left, so I think I should let a couple of you ask some questions if anyone has any. Yeah, go ahead, Amy.
I've heard from other firefighters that there's been more money put into prevention, balancing things better. What do you think led to that?
You know, so a lot of it, I think, was cultural over time. You know, the early part of fire service, when I got started, you know, the leadership there was pretty much out of the military or agriculture. And there was a certain mindset that went with that. I think over time, slowly, the joke is we're 200 years of tradition unimpeded by progress. There's some uncomfortable truth to that. So I think some of it's just been professional development and leadership over time. I think data analytics has gotten to where, rightfully so, public safety professionals are being asked hard questions. And so I think it's been a reaction to those. So again, the data, Nancy's working on this, we have to have a data commons that people can put into. We don't share data right now. I'll pose this statement to the insurers. I don't think you can possibly know your total aggregated book of business risk unless you know your adjacent risk. And you don't share data that way. And you certainly don't write policies for saturation that way. And yet in urban conflagrations, which is what we're responding to here, that's going to be one of the primary exposures. And so we have to rethink the way we do data. Data will drive better decisions.
Want to weigh in on data?
I thought they invited me as an actuary to be the one that injected actuarial humor here, but I guess I'm supposed to talk about data. Frank is right. We are, I think there's been so much confusion about mitigation of wildfire, and that particular peril is very difficult to model and measure, mostly because the risk for any individual house is mostly determined by the risk around it. And measuring the risk conditions using a drone or a satellite or whatever, it gets you part of the way there, but it doesn't get you some of the most important drivers of risk. So we started out about a year ago and met with all the major cat model vendors, some reinsurers, fire professionals, insurers, and said, what do you not know on the ground? What are the things that would make your model less blind? What would make your model better? And you know, that's actually answering the question, why can't you explain what will reduce the risk, which is what everybody wants to do, but everybody's frustrated that the insurance industry is not doing well enough. So we got some answers, and we created a series of work streams, one of them involving IBHS, which I'm pretty excited about, piloting better data around how do you disrupt fire pathways into a community? How do you evaluate the effectiveness of fire suppression on the ground for a major wildfire, which is different than, like your normal one-house fires. And how do you understand conditions that do change pretty rapidly, vegetation around a house? How do you know if somebody has a cocktail mint garden right next to her house? Not me, no. Yes, it actually is me. Sorry, Frank. But so if you can drive down the cost of getting that data and make the data available to people, then they'll actually know what they're being evaluated based on. They might not understand these complicated models or risk scores or whatever, but they do understand that they got evaluated on X date by X person, or maybe their FireWise community or their fire chief did the evaluation, or maybe they did it themselves using their cell phone app. But if all of that information is fed into one database, it actually drives down the cost of getting crucial information that everybody needs. FireWise communities, fire professionals, CAL FIRE, their corresponding agencies in other states. And so that's where you can actually get collective action.
Here's what we're gonna do, because we only have a couple of minutes. Say both your questions, and then as fast as you can, answer them. Go ahead, and then we'll go to Karen. Okay, two great questions that are going to take way too long to answer than we have. So we're going to go down the line, and you're going to say what you can in like 45 seconds each. You want to start with Nancy or Frank? Which way are we going to go here? Frank, we're starting with you.
One of our disconnects is we want people to mitigate locally, but we price risk regionally.
Wow, good job.
Yeah, he's so pithy. I'll just talk about workforce. We need to work with the employers. That's it. That's what the smartest workforce people have been telling me. We have to work with the employers, whoever's going to be employing those people, because they're going to train them.
So to the workforce question, yes. And I would just add to that, I mean, I think it's going to require a pretty significant investment in trade schools, junior colleges, community colleges to really bring that workforce online. And I think Louisiana would be a great place to do it. To the second question about the positive feedback loop, I'll take a moment on that. So I actually don't think about it that way. I would disagree with that. I think a lot of that is sort of a semantic argument it's kind of a shell game, right? Like, we all are admitting that there's going to be an astronomically large price tag associated with climate impacts. And we're really just talking about like who's going to pay what and where. And I think to the point that Frank and others on the panel started to make here, like, we're going to pay for this one way or another. Right? It's either going to be on the front end through mitigation, or it's going to be on the back end through response, recovery, very painful experiences that include loss of life and property. And so, I think we're at the point now where we just need to decide, right? How are we going to pay this huge price tag?
Okay, so I'll try to piggyback off of that. So very quickly, the cost of risk is the cost of risk. Somebody's got to bear the cost of risk. And if the cost of risk is increasing, somebody's got to bear the increasing cost of risk. And there's just no way around it. So agree, we can talk about mitigation all day long. If we're not, let's set mitigation aside and say we're just not going to get there. We're just not going to reduce the underlying risk because all the people in the room want to do it and all the people outside the room don't care, don't know, whatever. So we don't get it done. We can't decrease the cost of risk. So we're all sitting on it and trying to figure out who pays it. And the best way I can think of, ground up, grassroots, is to say you've got to price the risk. You've got to price the risk appropriately, not subsidizing, not hiding what the cost of the risk is. Price the risk, and then you've got to figure out who cannot afford the price of the risk but cannot afford to move, and we transparently subsidize that. We find ways to help those people, and the people who can afford to move or they can afford to foot the cost of that risk, do so. That's sort of brutal, but where I stand on it.
I'll answer the workforce question since I'm the one actually building homes. I think that it's important to educate, right? Like, we have to educate individuals. We have to invest in trade schools. We have to talk to the workforce commissions. But the other thing that I think is really, really important is after a disaster, there's so many companies that come rushing into different communities. And to your point, there were contractors that came in and said, oh, you don't need this because I'm trying to get a quick flip to move on to something else. how do we invest in our own community and our own contractors, right? Educate them, have trade schools that teach them all the things that they need to know, and then invest back into our local communities and our local contractors who have the best interests.
And on top of that, make sure that they have jobs year-round. That's something that insurers could help with, right? Don't have it be a seasonal thing so that this person who just got trained has like a job for 3 months and then has to sit on the sidelines. If it's a different job, have it be adjacent.
They could be fire inspectors. Okay, so I want to amplify what Laurie said. Insurance companies are required under pretty much all state regulations to charge higher premiums to higher risk policies and lower premiums to lower risk policies, to group them according to their risk. They are not allowed, it's illegal to charge different amounts based on ability to pay. We're not allowed to surcharge for wealthier people who have the same risk as lower income people. Government can do that. And so, to Laurie's point, if we can micro-target where the actual risk tiers are coming from, then we can allocate scarce government resources towards those most in need. I would like to see government resources targeting the people most in need, not people with vacation homes, not people with a lot of disposable income. That would make me happy.
Thank you, everyone. And now we have another break.